Hi, I'm John from Origin Effects, and I'm here to talk to you about the RevivalDRIVE range of pedals and how you can use them to replace the conventional amp in your signal chain. But why would you want to replace an amp with a pedal? Well, most of our favourite guitar tones come from vintage amps cranked all the way up. But that's not always practical for a number of reasons, especially for home recording situations. So maybe you just want to run direct to your audio interface instead. Or perhaps you're travelling light to gigs with just a guitar and a pedal board and using the house backline instead of your own amp. Perhaps you need a few different classic sounds, but you probably can't take 4 amps with you. Maybe it's a combination of all these things and you just need a rig that can adapt to every situation. We love vintage amps at Origin Effects, and all the pedals in the RevivalDRIVE range really do give you uncompromising vintage amp tone in pedal form. But it's worth mentioning that even though these pedals do recreate the sounds and the feel of vintage valve amps, they are just pedals. If you do need to be loud, you'll still need an amp, a powered monitor, or something to fill your stage. But it doesn't need to be a big, heavy, traditional valve amp. The way that the RevivalDRIVE pedals get their fantastic amp-like tones is by recreating the whole signal path of a valve amp in all analog transistor-based circuitry. They even include a push-pull output section with its own reactive load, unlike most amp-in-a-box pedals which simply recreate the preamp section of a famous amplifier. This means that they can be a very convincing and practical way to replace the amp in your signal chain, especially when running direct to an interface or a PA system. Of course, the post-drive EQ circuit on the RevivalDRIVE pedals means you can tailor their voicing to work with a typical guitar amp. But we're focusing on what happens when you select power amp mode, disabling that filter and outputting the full unadulterated signal from the pedal's emulated amp circuitry. It's recently become a very popular practice for recording guitarists to connect their favourite valve amp to a reactive load and a cabinet simulator, allowing them to capture proper guitar sounds without the complication of miking up a speaker cabinet. A reactive load is a device that takes the speaker output from your valve amplifier and safely dissipates the power, leaving you with a tiny line level signal that can be connected to the input of your interface or mixer. It also reacts with the output section of your amp in the same way that a speaker would, giving you the same response and feel that you'd expect on a loud stage. It allows you to crank your amp up into the sweet spot without the excessive volume that usually comes with it. Instead, you just hook up a cab sim and play as quietly as you like. This kind of rig might seem like a bit of a present-day fad, but it's actually been going on for decades and was at the heart of the huge and infamous rack rigs of the 1980s. The other advantage of this setup is, besides getting your amp in the zone and recording a line-level signal, you can also use this signal to feed other effects like delays and reverbs, placing them after the sound of a cranked amp, rather than compromising with an effects loop and getting all of your overdrive from the preamp section of your amplifier. It's the same as how you'd process your guitar sound in a studio, and this setup lets you use those studio guitar sounds in your own rig. You can even use this signal to feed a flat power amp, giving you this perfect studio guitar sound up to any volume you need. Of course, if you were to do this with a real valve amp and all the gear in an 80s rig, it would be hugely impractical and complicated, and this is where the RevivalDRIVE pedals step in. All the pedals in the range, including the RevivalTREM and the Magma 57, feature a complete valve amp signal path recreated in miniature. This includes a proper push-pull output section and a reactive load, giving you the same tones and the same all-important feel as the rig I've just described. This means you really can do away with an entire valve amp and an expensive reactive load and just drop a single pedal anywhere you want in your pedal board signal chain. As well as a faithful replica of a valve amp circuit, these pedals also have very high headroom, meaning that they'll take all of your boost and drive pedals just like a real amp, and their output can be fed straight to a cabinet simulator or stereo effects for that studio grade sound. Speaking of sounds, it's about time you heard some examples. First, I'm using a RevivalDRIVE Compact with a classic crunch sound. I've got a Cali 76 stacked edition first in the chain, and the boost comes courtesy of a Tube Screamer Mini. I'm running into a 2 notes cab M with some reverb and delay added in post. The beauty of this setup is that there's no compromise when taking your studio tones on the road. For this next example, I've swapped the RevivalDRIVE Compact for a RevivalTREM. And instead of a cab sim, I'm using a Seymour Duncan Power Stage 170 power amp into a 2x12 cab, which I've mic'd up. I've also added a reverb pedal between the RevivalTREM and the power amp to get some of the ambience that I'd added in my DAW. The best thing about this rig is that it's analog and it's simple. The process isn't actually any different from using a traditional valve amp, which is something that can put people off using modelling rigs in this kind of situation. The other thing that might put them off is the lack of realism and connectedness that sometimes people experience with digital modelling. In most situations, a few good sounds is enough, and 2 or 3 realistic sounding pedals will get you there, especially once you add in a boost or a drive or a fuzz. And with this basic setup that you've seen here, I've covered brown Fender tones all the way up to crank plexi, and I could get through plenty of gigs with that. To sum it all up, the RevivalDRIVE range of pedals really are analog amp emulations, and we pride ourselves on the fact that they retain the sound and the feel of the real thing. Lots of players these days are moving towards ampless rigs, some of them willingly and some more reluctantly, but what's true for most of them is that they want to get as close as they can to the experience of using a real amp in terms of sound, response and simplicity. Doing this is the RevivalDRIVE speciality, and these pedals really do allow you to place all the best bits of a valve amp right at the heart of your pedal board. I hope this video has helped you understand how one of the RevivalDRIVE pedals could actually replace the amp in your signal chain, especially if you like to run direct in the studio or even at gigs. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and don't forget to subscribe to the Origin Effects YouTube channel. And for more information on these pedals or any of the rest of our products, please visit origineffects.com. Thanks for watching.